Hi and welcome back. First of all, I'd like to really thank those of you who took part in the survey that I put out for the type of art videos that you're most interested in seeing. And the results, I think, were really, really interesting. I was very surprised to see that by quite a large margin, people were interested in longer watercolour landscape tutorials. And the survey is still available. If you click on the heading on my YouTube page for the communities page, you'll see the survey there, and you just click on the option that you like. Apologies that there's a typo in the last option. It should say abstract instead of landscape and 5 minutes instead of 15 minutes. But I've never been particularly good at typing or proofreading. So today I'm going to be painting this painting that I call A Bend in the River, and it's of the Cuckmere Valley with the River Cuckmere and the South Downs in the background. One of my favourite places in the world to go and sketch and paint and just generally walk and really enjoy the beauty of it. So this is what I'm going to be painting today. I'm painting it from one of my own photographs. And there'll be a 4-part, more detailed set of tutorials over on Patreon, complete with the reference photographs for the line work and the photo to download. So the first thing to do is to simplify the photograph and to draw it out onto the page. Now, I did a thumbnail sketch first to get the tones right and the composition right, and so using that thumbnail sketch is quite easy once I know where I'm going to follow that roadmap and just simply put in the horizon line, the distant slope of the downs and the tree line. There's quite a few buildings in the photograph, so I'm going to simplify that down just to a couple of buildings. I want this to be a loose watercolour painting. I don't want it to be too fussy and too fiddly. So simplification, I think, down to what I think are the most appealing features is important at this stage. I like to sketch out my scene quite simply and using a large leaded pencil, and this is an ordinary carpenter's pencil, and like when you're using a big brush, it keeps you looser because you can't fiddle around with it. Using a large pencil for sketching means that again you can't fiddle around and get sort of bogged down with detail. It enables you to sketch really loosely. So for my sketch here, all I need is the slope of the downs, the mid-ground tree line with buildings. I've reduced the number of buildings there. There's quite a few in the photograph, but I've reduced it down to 2. And that tree line and the buildings will be my focal point. They will have the most detail, the darkest tones, hopefully the most contrast between the buildings and the darkest parts of the trees, so that the eye will be drawn there. And I'm hoping to use sort of S or Z shaped composition, sort of subtly, to lead the viewer from the foreground grasses and the bank of the river across to the gate, then across the far bank of the river, and then across the mid-ground tree line to the buildings, then up to the hills and the sky. So I'm going to start off by wetting the paper all over in the sky, well, where I want the paint to be applied. I'm leaving dry patches so that I can have some clouds there, and also so that I can have some soft and a few hard edges in the sky. I'm using an Escoda size 14 synthetic mop brush, but any large wash brush will do the job for the sky. So I'm going to mix up some yellow ochre, nice watery mixture, and use that to start with, just to add a little bit of glow into the sky here and there, as if it was a little bit of reflected sunlight and warmth. keeping it nice and pale, remembering that it's going to dry back even paler because watercolour always dries back, so you want to put it on slightly darker than you're thinking of. Now I'm mixing up some cobalt blue with some ultramarine and with plenty of water, and then adding that into my sky around my cloudy shapes. I'm using Millford 100% cotton cold press watercolour paper today. It's £140 weight or 300 GSM. It's taped to my board, and my board is at an angle of about 45 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. I don't pre-stretch my paper. I find at £140 weight and this size, it'll buckle a little bit as I paint on it, but then it will flatten out completely as it dries. So I'm making sure that my sky becomes lighter, closer to the horizon. And as the hills are going to be a little bit darker than the sky, they're going to be the mid-tones, whereas the sky is going to be the lightest tones. I don't mind if I paint through them a little bit or paint over them. And lastly, for the sky, I've just dipped into quite a watery solution of burnt sienna, and then removed all the moisture, nearly all the moisture from my brush, by dabbing it onto a paper towel, and then putting in that slight brown hint, that golden, which goes with the golden glow and the blue, to give me these lovely sort of greyish brownish cloud shadows that should soften and diffuse as it dries. And now I'm painting with dry brush strokes, horizontal brush strokes across the river. The river is a tidal river, quite fast flowing in the photograph, so I'm not looking to get reflections, but I am looking to get some sort of sparkle, so a little bit of the white of the paper showing through where I pull across that same sky colour, so the sky is reflected in the river. So I'm just going to leave that alone to make sure it's dry, and while it's drying I can mix up a sort of a yellowish, quite a sort of an earthy green. So I'm using cobalt blue, touch of ultramarine, some yellow ochre and a little bit of permanent yellow, which you can use cad yellow if you don't have permanent yellow, and I'm painting it using my 3/4 inch flat brush. I'm painting it across that sort of pale golden field in the distance, and then I'm going to paint all the grasses with it, putting in some sort of brush strokes with a sort of directionality to them to start to suggest the grasses in the foreground. And then I will also add some dry brush horizontally across that field too, just to keep it nice and fresh. There's still quite a bit more to do to this, but if you'll remember, my focus is not the foreground field, but I just need to have the foreground just interesting enough to lead the eye into my point of interest, which is the buildings and the distant trees. So at this stage I'm building up my mid-tones across the painting. I did the lights first with the sky and the river, and now my mid-tones, which are only really slightly darker than than in tone or in value, but dark enough, adding a little bit of blue to my green, so that I'm cooling it down, making it a little bit darker, and introducing a bit more variety to the foreground, still keeping the directionality of the brush strokes, and then painting across the field that's in the distance behind the buildings, but just underneath the hills. That sort of glows a little bit, so I want to keep it nice and flat, nice and thin, so it gives me that illusion of depth and distance. And this slightly cooler blue or green, I'm going to use, varying up the tones a little bit, to get in my distant hills, which are covered in trees. So I'm going to try and create that impression very simply, just through a little bit of brushwork and varying up the tones. But I'm trying to keep the paint fairly pale here, and in sort of greyish and bluish tones, and that should help that part of the painting to recede into the distance, so that I get that sort of aerial perspective created in my painting, so that my colours will be brighter and fresher in the midground and the foreground, and slightly paler and cooler across the distant hills. So I'm dipping into my yellow ochre or my burnt sienna or my blues at different times, just to slightly vary up my green so that it's more interesting. And I started off with a flat brush to get the edges of the hills with some of those sort of suggestions of trees, and then going back to the large synthetic squirrel mop, using it damp just to spread that wash down and bringing it down to my midground tree line, which of course is where my darkest tones are going to be. And now with a chopped up piece of plastic store card, I'm using the cut corner to scratch a few more of these directional lines through my foreground grasses, and this drags the point through the damp paint and adds a bit of extra texture to my foreground grasses. So that's the first layer done. Once it's completely dry, I can mix up a stronger, drier, more pigmented green. I want it to be really dark, so again I'm using my blues, ultramarine and cobalt, and quite a bit of burnt sienna added to it, and a couple of the yellows as well. I'm just waiting till I get a really deep, rich shadow green, and using a small synthetic round brush, I'm going to cut round the top of the buildings first and then start painting in these really shadowy trees. So I'm keeping a nice straight line so I get a good edge and negatively painting around my buildings. And hopefully you can see straight away how using this darker, richer paint and negatively painting around the shape of the buildings has really made the buildings pop, and the eyes being really drawn to that area. So I'm keeping the base of the trees nice and flat because that's the field boundary at the base of the hills, and just painting in these sort of ragged, blobby sort of shapes, which will give me my loose tree effects over the hill. And I'll continue to either lighten the mixture or darken it here and there, dropping in some darker areas, and continue painting across the whole tree line. Now we have all the buildings showing, and I can paint a few of these little bushes and shrubs across the front of the buildings and this slightly closer field boundary. So I'll paint across the rest of the tree line in exactly the same way. And as I go, I can make adjustments to it. I can either add a bit more of this dark paint to deepen the tone, particularly at the base of the trees and here and there to add some variety, or I can soften back with a clean damp brush to lighten up certain areas of it. As I say, all to give that little bit of variation to this focus of the painting. So as the paint dries back lighter, I can keep adding my darks, particularly around the building, because that will really draw the eye. At the moment, the buildings really pop out, but they won't pop out quite so much once I've painted them and got their red roofs, but they should still work as the focal point, because of course that sort of red is a complementary colour to green, and so I'm hoping that they should look really nice against those lovely dark, almost blackish greens. Back to my plastic store card with the cut corner and scraping through just a few suggestions of tree trunks and the light hitting them. And now just a few simple touches of paint with the tips of the flat brush using the same dark mixture. I'm increasing the tonal value on the far riverbank, on that bend of the riverbank. And again, that helps to lead the eye. Once I've painted in the fence or gate at the edge of the river, then hopefully you'll see how this sort of S or Z shaped composition works to lead the eye in a sort of zigzag across the painting. So that's just about all of my mid-ground trees done and the riverbank. So I'll leave it all to dry and then come back with that dark mixture and a fine sword liner brush and just subtly introduce a few stems of grasses into the foreground using the tip of the sword liner. I don't want too much because I don't want to have my foreground dark. I want it tonally to sort of match the distant hills and the sky. But what I'm going to do is add a glaze in a little while to it so it'll warm it up and give it a bit more intensity of hue but not of tone. But I need that to be completely dry before I can glaze. So while I'm waiting, I can start to paint my buildings. I've mixed up some burnt sienna and I'm using my flat brush to paint the roofs. These buildings are too far in the distance to have too much in the way of details, but I'll just put a little bit of shadow where there's sort of a large sort of barn door opening, and then I shall increase the tone on the roofs a little bit with another layer of burnt sienna. With a loose painting like this, we're relying on tonal values and hues and colour contrasts to make the suggestions of what we're trying to show rather than painting in too much detail. And then lastly, just a little bit of dirty paint water on the left side and the right side of the buildings, but leaving a little speck of unpainted white paper helps to knock back the white of the paper, but still gives us that pop of pale tone there that draws the eye to the buildings. And now to add a few details to this fence or gate. It's quite interesting in the sort of Cuckmere River Valley. It's a river that has lots of meanders and little oxbow lakes and ponds and things like that, and cuttings across from one part of the river to another. And it's also covered with these little tiny sunken fences where the fields get flooded and sometimes livestock graze. And it's a really attractive feature. So I'm going to paint this in using the tips of the flat brush and using a sort of my darker mixture of cobalt and ultramarine and burnt sienna, but this time with a bit of Paynes grey added to it to darken it up really nicely, and slowly building up the planks of this old rotten fence. Trying not to paint it too perfectly, I just want a sort of rough impression of it, because again, this is part of the device that I'm using to hopefully guide the viewer's eye around the painting, sort of from one area to another. And now for that glaze to warm up the foreground. This is permanent yellow, knocked back slightly with a little bit of yellow ochre and a dab of ultramarine, but it gives me this really sort of bright, cool yellow, and glazing it quickly across the foreground. The transparent nature of watercolour allows all the brushwork to be seen below, and this more intense hue really works better in the foreground and pushes the paler, sort of cooler distance back even further. So now it's just on to the finishing touches, some slightly darker tone dropped in wet on top of the glaze, just here and there to add a bit more tone to the foreground, but just in a very, very subtle way. And now using my small calligraphy brush and my dark mixed with Paynes grey, I'm going to pick out a few trunks and branches in the distant tree line, showing through some of the lighter areas. And this small amount of detail hopefully just pulls together that tree line and keeps the eye focused on that area. And now just some thin dark shadows under the eaves of the roofs. Maybe the hint of a few little windows, just with the tips of the calligraphy brush. And I think that's that will be it finished for the buildings. And now just mixing up a sort of light, cool, fairly watery green and touching in a few lighter areas of trees on this hillside on the right. And this slightly warmer green helps to push forward the darker greens of that tree line. So that's the painting finished. I'm going to remove the tape because it's really nice to see a painting with its clean white border. It sort of in a way helps us to see it with fresh eyes, almost as if it was in a frame, and enables us to see if we've finished it, if our values are right, if we're drawn to the focal point sufficiently, all that kind of stuff. And it's even easier to see if it's put against a clean white board like this. So I hope you enjoyed that one come together from drawing through to finished loose painting, and hopefully you can see how by using sort of tonal values and suggested detail that you can bring a scene like this together in quite a sort of convincing way. It takes a bit of practice, but I would highly recommend this kind of approach, going out maybe making your own sketches, taking some photographs of beauty spots near you, and then seeing if you can simplify them and then create paintings of your own beautiful scenery. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support, especially as I approach that milestone of 75,000 subscribers, of which I'm so grateful. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, it's free, and click on the bell icon if you want to get notifications when I post. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.